They called him Slow-Mo Harold, laughed at the way he shuffled through his garden, made jokes about the old Asian man who talked to his roses. For months, they tormented the 92-year-old gardener, thinking he was just another harmless old man who couldn't fight back. They had no idea they were mocking a Korean War veteran. They had no idea about the Purple Heart hidden in his closet. They had no idea that beneath those shaking hands was a man who had survived the Frozen Chosen campaign. And they definitely had no idea that one day he would save their lives. Welcome to One Human, One Story. Before we begin this incredible story of hidden heroism, tell us in the comments if you've ever completely underestimated someone based on their appearance. And if you believe stories like this prove that heroes walk among us every day, hit that subscribe button, because every human has a story, and some stories will change how you see the world forever. Harold Kim was 92 years old and moved like it. Every morning at exactly 7, he would shuffle out to his front garden in the small town of Cedar Falls, Iowa. His back curved from decades of work. His hands shook slightly as he watered his tomatoes. His steps were careful and deliberate, like someone afraid of falling. The neighborhood kids called him Slow-Mo Harold behind his back. Harold had lived in the same house for 47 years. A modest 2-story home on Maple Street with the most beautiful garden in the neighborhood. Roses that bloomed in perfect rows. Vegetable patches that produced enough food to feed half the block. Fruit trees that provided shade and apples every fall. Harold spent 8 hours a day in that garden. It was his sanctuary, his therapy, his reason for getting up each morning. The teenagers saw something different. They saw an old Asian man who moved too slow, who spoke with an accent they found funny, who seemed to have nothing but time and flowers. They would skateboard past, making jokes. Sometimes they knocked over his garbage cans just to watch him slowly pick everything up. They never meant real harm. They were just bored kids who saw an easy target. Harold never complained, never called parents, never acknowledged their behavior. He would simply clean up whatever mess they made and return to his garden. The neighbors felt sorry for him. Some thought he was too old to live alone. Others wondered why he didn't move somewhere safer. But Harold stayed. This was his home. This garden was his purpose. What none of them knew was that Harold Kim had earned his slow movements. The limp in his left leg came from shrapnel doctors never fully removed. The tremor in his hands was from nerve damage caused by frostbite during a Korean winter that lasted longer than any winter should. The careful way he moved was not from age alone, but from 73 years of living with wounds that never properly healed. Harold had been 19 when he stepped off the transport ship at Busan Harbor in September 1950. Fresh-faced kid from San Francisco Chinatown. Second-generation Korean-American who spoke perfect English but looked like the enemy to some fellow soldiers. Harold volunteered not because he wanted to fight, but because he wanted to prove he belonged, that he was American enough to serve his country, even if that country was at war with the land of his ancestors. The 2nd Infantry Division stationed Harold near the 38th parallel. Frozen Chosen territory. The area where Chinese forces would launch their massive winter offensive that caught American forces completely unprepared. Harold served as a forward observer. His job was to spot enemy movements and radio coordinates back to artillery units. Dangerous work that required long hours in advanced positions with minimal backup. The worst day came November 27, 1950. Harold's observation post was overrun during the Chinese offensive. 12 men stationed at the forward position. 3 survived the initial assault. Harold was one of them. The other 2 were Corporal Jimmy Martinez from Texas and Private Danny Sullivan from Boston. They held their position 6 hours against overwhelming odds while waiting for evacuation that never came. When enemy fire disabled their radio, Harold made a decision that would haunt him 73 years. He left the safety of their bunker to reach a working radio position 300 yards away. He had to cross open ground under enemy fire. Jimmy Martinez tried to stop him. Danny Sullivan said it was suicide. But without communication, they were dead anyway. Harold ran. He made it to the radio, called in their position, requested immediate evacuation, artillery support, medical assistance. Then he ran back toward his position. That's when the mortar round exploded 20 feet from his left side. Shrapnel tore through his leg. The concussion threw him into a shell crater where he lay unconscious 4 hours while battle raged around him. Harold woke to silence. The Chinese had withdrawn. American forces retaken the position, but Jimmy Martinez and Danny Sullivan were gone. Not dead. Gone. Captured. Taken prisoner during the hours Harold was unconscious. Harold saved himself by leaving the bunker. His friends were captured because he wasn't there to help defend their position. Medics found Harold half frozen in the crater, his leg mangled, his hands frostbitten from lying in snow without gloves. But he was alive. Jimmy Martinez and Danny Sullivan spent the next 3 years in Chinese prison camps. Jimmy died of pneumonia in 1952. Danny was released during prisoner exchange in 1953, weighing 87 pounds and unable to speak about what happened. Harold received the Purple Heart for wounds received in action. He also received survivor's guilt that would follow him the rest of his life. He had done his job correctly, radioed for help, followed proper procedures, but 2 men were captured while he lay unconscious. 2 men who might have survived if he stayed to fight instead of running to make a radio call. Harold returned to San Francisco in 1953. Married childhood sweetheart Mary Chen in 1955. Worked as a machinist 38 years. Raised 2 children who gave him 4 grandchildren. Built a quiet life that never included talking about Korea. The Purple Heart stayed in a shoebox in his closet. The memories stayed buried under decades of routine and work. Mary died in 2018. The children moved to other states. The grandchildren visited twice a year. Harold was alone with his garden and memories. He spoke to his roses in Korean sometimes. The language of his childhood he had almost forgotten. The roses seemed to understand. They bloomed better when he spoke in the old language. The teenagers saw none of this complexity. They saw an old man who moved slowly and seemed harmless. Someone they could tease without consequences. They had no idea they were mocking a man who survived one of the forgotten wars, who carried shrapnel in his leg and guilt in his heart, who had earned every careful step he took. That changed on a Tuesday afternoon in June 2024. Harold was watering tomatoes when he heard shouting from the corner store direction. 3 teenagers running down Maple Street, fast, panicked. Behind them came 2 men with guns. Armed robbery gone wrong. Chase that spilled from commercial district into residential neighborhood where Harold lived peacefully nearly half a century. The teenagers were the same kids who had been taunting Harold for months. 16-year-old Marcus Williams, 15-year-old Jessica Chen, 14-year-old Tyler Brooks. They had been at the corner store buying snacks when 2 armed men burst in demanding money. The teenagers ran. The robbers followed. Now all 5 people were heading directly toward Harold's front yard. The teenagers reached Harold's garden first. Out of breath, scared, looking for somewhere to hide. They saw Harold standing with his garden hose and made a decision that probably saved their lives. They ran behind his house, crouched behind his rose bushes, hoped the old man wouldn't give them away. The armed robbers arrived 30 seconds later, both men in their 20s, both clearly high on something that made their movements jerky and unpredictable, both carrying pistols they waved around without regard for where they pointed them. They saw Harold standing in his garden and assumed he was no threat. "Old man," one shouted. "You see some kids run through here?" Harold looked at them calmly. He had seen many men with guns. These two were amateurs, scared, desperate, dangerous, because they had no training and no discipline. "I don't see any kids," Harold said quietly, his voice steady despite adrenaline starting to flow through 73-year-old veins. "Don't lie to me," the second robber said, stepping closer. "We saw them come this way. They're hiding somewhere around here." He pointed his gun at Harold's chest. "Tell us where they are, or you're gonna have problems, old man." Harold looked at the gun, looked at the man holding it, felt something shift inside him he hadn't felt since 1950. "I said I don't see any kids," Harold repeated, but his voice was different now, harder. The voice of someone who had been threatened by men with guns before, men who were much better at using them than these two nervous amateurs. "Maybe you should look somewhere else." The robbers exchanged glances. They weren't getting the response they expected from the harmless old gardener. "You think you're tough?" the first robber said. "You think because you're old we won't hurt you?" He raised his gun toward Harold's face. "Last chance. Where are those kids?" Harold's hands weren't shaking anymore. His back seemed straighter. When he spoke, his voice carried authority that made both robbers pause. "Son," Harold said quietly, "you're pointing that gun like you've never held one before. Your stance is wrong, your grip is loose, and you're standing too close to your target." The robbers looked confused. This wasn't how scared old men were supposed to respond to armed threats. "You want some advice? Put the guns down and walk away before someone gets hurt." The second robber laughed nervously. "Are you crazy, old man? We're the ones with guns here." But Harold was already moving. Not slowly like the teenagers had always seen him move. Fast, precise, with movements that spoke of training most people never receive. He stepped forward instead of backward, grabbed the first robber's wrist with his left hand, twisted the gun away with his right. 73 years of buried muscle memory took over. The 19-year-old soldier who survived Chinese winter offensive was still inside the 92-year-old gardener. Harold had the first gun in less than 2 seconds, had the second robber disarmed and on the ground in less than 5. Both men found themselves face down on Harold's driveway with a Korean War veteran's knee in their backs. "Tyler," Harold called calmly, "call 911. Tell them we have 2 armed robbery suspects in custody." The teenagers emerged from behind rose bushes, eyes wide, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The slow old man they had been mocking had just disarmed 2 younger men with guns. Had done it so quickly and smoothly it looked choreographed. Marcus Williams was first to find his voice. "Mr. Kim, where did you learn?" Harold looked at him with the same calm expression he wore while watering tomatoes. "I learned it a long time ago," he said simply, "in a place where moving slow meant dying young." Police arrived 6 minutes later, found 2 robbery suspects secured with zip ties Harold kept in his gardening shed. Police took statements. Robbers were arrested. Teenagers were praised for having sense to run instead of trying to be heroes. Harold was thanked for quick thinking and courage. Local news wanted to interview him. Harold politely declined. He had never sought attention for what happened in Korea. He wasn't going to start seeking it now. But word spreads in small towns. By evening, everyone on Maple Street knew Harold Kim wasn't just a harmless old gardener. He was someone who had skills, someone who had history, someone who deserved more respect than he had been getting. The teenagers who mocked him felt ashamed. The neighbors who pitied him felt foolish. Jessica Chen was first to approach Harold the next morning. She found him in his garden as usual, watering tomatoes, moving slowly again. The warrior who emerged the day before was hidden once more behind the facade of a harmless old man. "Mr. Kim," she said quietly, "I want to apologize for how we treated you. We didn't know." "You didn't know what?" Harold asked gently. "That I was old enough to be your grandfather? That I came from a different country? That I spoke with an accent?" Jessica looked confused. "We didn't know you were... that you could..." She struggled to find words. "We didn't know you were dangerous." Harold smiled sadly. "I'm not dangerous, child. I'm just old. And sometimes old people have had to learn things they wish they never needed to know." "Were you in the army?" Tyler Brooks asked. He had been the one to make the most jokes about Harold's slow movements. Now he seemed genuinely curious rather than mocking. "Yes," Harold said simply. "A long time ago. In a war most people have forgotten." He turned back to his tomatoes. "Korea," he added quietly. 1950 to 1953. The teenagers stayed to help Harold with his garden that morning. They asked careful questions. Harold gave careful answers. He didn't tell them about Jimmy Martinez or Danny Sullivan. Didn't mention survivor's guilt or nightmares that still came sometimes. But he told them about the cold, about being young and scared and far from home, about learning that courage isn't absence of fear, but action despite fear. Over following weeks, something changed on Maple Street. The teenagers started stopping by Harold's garden regularly, not to mock him, but to help him, to listen to his stories, to learn from someone who had lived through things they couldn't imagine. Harold found himself enjoying their company, their energy, their questions about a world that seemed as foreign to them as their world sometimes seemed to him. Marcus Williams asked about the Purple Heart one afternoon. Harold had mentioned it briefly while talking about his service. "Can we see it?" Marcus asked. "I've never seen a real medal before." Harold hesitated. The Purple Heart had been in that shoebox 71 years. He hadn't looked at it since Mary died. Wasn't sure he wanted to look at it now. But something about Marcus's genuine curiosity changed his mind. Harold went inside, brought out the shoebox, opened it carefully. Inside was the Purple Heart in its original case. A few photographs from Korea, a letter from Danny Sullivan written in 1954, "But now I'm living it differently." That was Robert's healing in a single sentence. Still carrying Vietnam, but carrying it differently. Not as a burden, but as a bridge. Not as shame, but as strength. Not as something that had broken him, but as something that had ultimately made him whole in a way he never could have been without the brokenness. Robert Chen retired from active practice in 2024 at the age of 73, but he didn't retire from service. He began training other therapists, mentoring veteran counselors, developing treatment protocols for delayed onset PTSD. His mission had evolved from healing himself to creating systems that could heal others. The nightmares still come sometimes. The flashbacks still happen. Robert still hears Tommy Martinez calling his name on quiet nights when his guard is down. But now, when he hears that voice, he responds differently. Instead of guilt, he feels gratitude. Instead of wondering why he survived, he celebrates that his survival had purpose. Instead of carrying the dead as burdens, he carries them as inspiration. Robert's story spreads through the veteran community like hope itself, proof that it's never too late to heal, that trauma can be transformed, that the wounded healer often becomes the most effective healer, that surviving is not something to feel guilty about, but something to feel grateful for, that carrying the dead means honoring them by living fully. Every veteran who walks into Robert's former practice now sees a plaque on the wall. It reads, "In memory of Sergeant Tommy Martinez and all the brothers who didn't make it home. They live on in the healing we provide to those who did." It's signed simply, Bobby Chen, Vietnam, 1970 to 1971. Survivor, healer, still serving. Robert Chen carried Vietnam's nightmares for 40 years before he learned to transform them into healing for others. His journey from broken veteran to master healer proves that our greatest wounds can become our greatest strengths. That survival guilt can become survival purpose. That the people who understand pain the deepest are often the ones who can heal it most effectively. So I ask you, have you ever met someone whose understanding seemed to come from personal experience rather than professional training? Someone whose empathy felt earned rather than learned. Someone who could guide you through darkness because they had walked that path themselves. Tell us about the wounded healers in your life, because here at One Human One Story, we believe that our scars can become sources of strength for others. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that healing is possible even after decades of pain. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about people who transform their trauma into triumph. And remember that the therapist or counselor helping you might be fighting battles similar to your own. Sometimes the wounded become the healers. Sometimes the broken become the bridge builders. And sometimes the people who carry the most pain become the ones who provide the most hope. Sometimes healing isn't about forgetting what happened. Sometimes it's about remembering differently. Not as something that destroyed you, but as something that prepared you to help others heal. Not as evidence of your weakness, but as proof of your strength. And sometimes, the best way to honor the dead is not by joining them, but by living fully in service to those who still need hope. So I ask you, have you ever underestimated someone based on their age or appearance, only to discover they were remarkable in ways you couldn't imagine? Tell us in the comments about the hidden heroes in your life, the people who taught you not to judge by first impressions. Because here at One Human One Story, we believe that everyone has a story worth telling. Everyone has depths worth discovering. And sometimes the people who seem the most ordinary are actually the most extraordinary. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that heroes come in unexpected forms. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about people who prove that strength, courage, and wisdom often hide behind quiet facades. And remember, the next time you see an elderly person moving slowly through their daily routine, they might be carrying stories of courage that would humble us all. Sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones who never tell us they're heroes at all. Opened it carefully. Inside was the Purple Heart in its original case. A few photographs from Korea. A letter from Danny Sullivan written in 1954. "This is what they gave me for getting hurt," Harold said, showing them the medal. "It's not for being brave. It's for surviving when others didn't." The teenagers passed the medal between them with reverent care. They had never held anything so old, so connected to real history. "Were you scared?" Jessica asked. Harold nodded. "Every day. But you learn to work through the fear, to do what needs to be done even when you're afraid. That's what I did yesterday when those men threatened you. Same thing I learned to do in Korea." "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" Tyler asked. "About what you did in the war? About being a hero?" Harold shook his head slowly. "I wasn't a hero. Heroes are the ones who didn't come home. I was just lucky. And sometimes being lucky feels worse than being brave." The teenagers didn't fully understand, but they sensed the weight behind his words. Word of Harold's Purple Heart spread through Cedar Falls. Veterans from later wars began stopping by his garden. Iraq veterans, Afghanistan veterans, Vietnam veterans who remembered being treated poorly when they came home. They recognized something in Harold's quiet dignity, his reluctance to talk about service, his focus on present tasks rather than past glory. The American Legion Post invited Harold to their monthly meeting. Harold politely declined. The VFW asked him to speak at their Veterans Day ceremony. Harold said he had nothing to say that hadn't already been said by better men, but gradually the visitors started coming. Veterans who had heard about the old Korean War vet who lived quietly and grew the best tomatoes in Iowa. Harold began to understand that his garden had become something more than a hobby. It was a gathering place, a sanctuary for men and women who had served and come home to a world that didn't always understand what they had experienced. They would sit among his roses and share stories they couldn't tell their families, find peace in the presence of someone who understood without judgment. The teenagers became part of this informal network. Marcus Williams started researching Korean War history for a school project. Jessica Chen learned basic Korean phrases to surprise Harold. Tyler Brooks began helping Harold with the heavier garden work that was becoming difficult for 92-year-old hands. They had learned that strength comes in many forms, that moving slowly doesn't mean moving without purpose. 1 year after the robbery, Harold's story reached a wider audience. A local journalist wrote about the quiet Korean War veteran who had saved 3 teenagers and created an informal support network for veterans in his garden. The story was picked up by national news, veterans organizations, military history groups. Harold found himself receiving letters from across the country. Some letters came from families of Korean War veterans who had never talked about their service. Others came from active duty soldiers who found inspiration in Harold's example of quiet service. A few came from historians who wanted to record Harold's memories for future generations. Harold answered each letter personally, brief responses that acknowledged their gratitude but deflected their praise. The Purple Heart Foundation contacted Harold about a program that reunited veterans with lost medals. Harold explained that his medal had never been lost, just forgotten, hidden away like the memories that came with it. The foundation asked if he would consider sharing his story with other veterans who struggled with survivor's guilt. Harold said he would think about it. The teenagers graduated from high school. Marcus Williams joined the Army. Jessica Chen studied international relations. Tyler Brooks became a teacher. They stayed in touch with Harold, visited when they could, brought their children to see the garden where they had learned that heroes don't always look like heroes, that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who never talk about fighting. Harold Kim died peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in March 2025. He was 93 years old. The teenagers who had once mocked him served as pallbearers at his funeral. Veterans from 4 different wars attended the service. The American Legion post that Harold had never joined provided an honor guard. His Purple Heart was buried with him, along with a letter from Danny Sullivan and a photograph of his garden in full bloom. The house on Maple Street was sold to a young family with children. They maintained Harold's garden according to detailed instructions he had left behind. The rose bushes still bloom every summer. The tomatoes still produce enough food to share with neighbors. Veterans still stop by sometimes to sit quietly among the flowers and remember a man who taught them that service continues long after the uniform comes off. The teenagers who Harold saved grew up to tell their children about the old gardener who moved slowly but acted quickly when it mattered, about learning not to judge people by appearances, about understanding that everyone carries stories we can't see, about the difference between weakness and gentleness, about heroes who don't need recognition because they're too busy living with honor. Harold's Purple Heart was donated to the Korean War Veterans Memorial Museum, where it sits in a display case next to a photograph of his garden and a brief description of his service. The placard doesn't mention the robbery, doesn't describe the teenagers he saved, just notes that Harold Kim served with distinction in Korea and lived quietly in Iowa until his death, that he was survived by children and grandchildren who loved him and a community that learned to see him clearly. But the real memorial to Harold Kim isn't in a museum. It's in the garden that still blooms on Maple Street. in the veterans who found peace among his roses, in the teenagers who learned that moving slowly doesn't mean moving without purpose, in the understanding that heroes walk among us every day. We just have to be wise enough to recognize them before it's too late. So I ask you, have you ever underestimated someone based on their age or appearance, only to discover they were remarkable in ways you couldn't imagine? Tell us in the comments about the hidden heroes in your life, the people who taught you not to judge by first impressions. Because here at One Human One Story, we believe that everyone has a story worth telling. Everyone has depths worth discovering. And sometimes the people who seem the most ordinary are actually the most extraordinary. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that heroes come in unexpected forms. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about people who prove that strength, courage, and wisdom often hide behind quiet facades. And remember, the next time you see an elderly person moving slowly through their daily routine, they might be carrying stories of courage that would humble us all. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never tell us they're heroes at all. Harold Kim never sought recognition for what he did in Korea or what he did on Maple Street. He just lived, quietly served when called upon, and grew the most beautiful garden in Cedar Falls, Iowa. That's the kind of heroism that changes the world, one small act at a time, one garden at a time, one life at a time.